Welcome, everybody, to Wormhole Agronomy Podcast. My name is Joe Alt. I'll be your host today, and we are kicking this off with a fascinating guest, Bob Gunzenhauser. And I'm just going to jump right in because I want to get straight to the questions that we are going to extract from his brain. Bob, if you wouldn't mind, who are you, where do you come from, and what do you do?
Well, thank you, Joe. Appreciate the opportunity to be here. My name is Bob Gunzenhauser. I don't know, there's a lot of titles I could wear, a lot of hats I've worn as well, but I would say pretty much I'm a scientist, I'm a farmer, I'm an instructor, a teacher. I'm a person who likes to study things and understand and be able to teach that to others. So it's where I'm at currently today. I am a professor at Iowa State, a professor of practice, actually, and it's a new role for a new degree major program called Digital and Precision Agriculture. And I just came on board with Iowa State in January of 26. And it's great to be able to come back home because this is where I got all my education at, my degrees. But prior to that, I was with Corteva Agriscience for 16 years, or Pioneer prior to that, and spent all my time there in the digital space, so digital precision areas. So we offered things like fit mapping, Field 360, later as in Circa with nitrogen management. I focused on there, and later with granular agronomy, also with nitrogen management primarily. But I also came to this through real world experience of farming. So I farmed for a number of years in South Central Iowa, and I grew up on that same farm, fifth generation farmer. And also I got my first job right out of college working for Ag Leader Technology. So I've been in the space for 30 years, both working in the production and precision or digital space in agriculture. So I'm trying to bring together not only what is the latest technology, but also on how do we apply that? How do we find value in this? But also how do you adapt it? People come up with great ideas and develop great technology, but if it's not going to be used by the end user, then it's really not worth a lot. So I want to make sure that we are developing technology and applying technology that's going to be valuable, it's useful, that farmers can pick it up, that there's an end value that's not only profitable, but also it reduces or makes people's lives easier. And I also think to be better stewards of the land while we're at it too. So there's a lot of things I'm going after here, but yeah, that's me in a nutshell. Like I said, from South Central Iowa, grew up there, and now based here in Ames.
You seem certainly more than qualified to answer some of these questions, so I'm thrilled to dig into that. From your perspective, how can digital and precision ag be used to further agronomy and specifically soil health?
Yeah, great question. So a lot of the work I'd done there at Corteva most recently was working with nitrogen management. And so digging into that, we used a crop model to simulate a lot of the different subsoil functions. So mineralization, nitrification, water movement, crop growth as well. And being able to have a crop model to simulate those things and run through different simulations really taught me a lot about what if we tried this? What if we did that? And so it also made me dig into and realize, well, the crop model is only as good as what's taught and what's been trained on. And there's a lot of sub functions built into it, but we also know that biology is very complex. And so a lot of what we were seeing there built in the model was just a mathematical representation of the underlying biology, which we knew was a lot more to it. And where it really led me towards is thinking there's a lot more to soils, to biology, to how can we measure it, how we see the interaction going on than meets the eye. And this is a great idea to get into it a little bit, but we can go even deeper. And I think tools like machine learning and now with artificial intelligence could take us even deeper there. Again, it's only as good as what's trained on, and we need to have good data to train it. But once you have that data, good observations, and we make it also, if we can develop the software that makes it easy to connect those observations with the outcomes or the situation we're in, then it makes it easier to build those models. One thing I learned it in Circa and Granular and Pioneer, was that we could build good models when we had good data, but it's hard sometimes to get good data. And we had to give the farmer a good reason to collect good data, or maybe the agronomist to collect good data. So we have to have a so what end in mind. But if we collect the right data, right information, and it could be multivariable, multivariate, multifaceted, very complex information, again, that's what machine learning and AI really can thrive on. And so we can capture a lot of those things and build at least a model that may get to 80, 90% of the way there, knowing that nature is probably infinitely more complex than we'll ever get to. But at least it can get us a long ways there and be able to run through those simulations and say, okay, if we do this, this happens. Here's what's going to occur. Is this a good thing or a bad thing? And how can we maximize the good things and minimize the bad things? How can we run through those models and simulate what they could do there?
Having some experience with that nitrogen model that was part of the Corteva platform, and knowing at the time it was probably one of the best tools that was currently in the market, do you have optimism that we will once again see something similar to that could do an even better job than what that model was able to do?
I think so. And I think as we learn more about those sub-functions of mineralization, nitrification, I think those are opportunities. I also think that bringing in some other inputs throughout the season might be useful. So not just weather, but then remote sensing, for example. And at the time when we had launched nitrogen management for Encirca initially, that was 13 years ago. And satellite imagery was not quite to the state it is today. And so there's things that we can do with imagery today to get the phenology, how does the plant responding. And what I like about that approach with remote sensing with nitrogen is that it can give us a lot more subfield details that we could not with Encirca and granular, because we were at the soil type or at the decision zone level. That gives having that ability to then also calibrate that model to to remote sensing, use as a training or as an adjustment factor, I think is also useful too. That model was based upon sometimes good conditions of how the crop would develop, and looking at remote sensing data, we find that, hey, corn doesn't always grow as fast, develop as fast under, say, waterlogged conditions early on the season as you think it would. So the model was built on other scenarios. So I think there's ways that that model could be updated and trained a little bit further. And there's folks that are involved with that. Sentinel Ag, based in Nebraska, has been working in that space and kind of taken on the mantle of nitrogen management since our time there at Corteva.
Well, that's very exciting to hear. I think it's long overdue for us to have improved tools for managing nitrogen. We still know it's the number one bugger we have to deal with corn, and anything that can lend us insight to help us do that is going to be a great development. Absolutely. So you'd mentioned earlier your time with Pioneer Corteva. I'm curious if you'd be willing to cite some of the other type of work you did. What were a couple of things that stood out as most significant and applicable research findings that you had made throughout your time there?
Well, before coming to Corteva, working being as a farmer and having grown up on a farm, nitrogen was a big thing of that. And also find out when you actually didn't put the nitrogen on, let's say the anhydrous tank ran out before the end of the pass, you'd see the effects of that. You'd see pretty low yielding corn. But in my trials at Corteva and granular, I did some nitrogen response trials where run from 0 up to 300 pounds of nitrogen. And sometimes you'd see typical responses where the economically optimum nitrogen rate was be about 160, 180. That's where you'd think it'd be at. Sometimes it'd be 240. Sometimes though it'd be like 60. And sometimes we'd find some pretty good yields even at 0 nitrogen, which would blow me away. I remember a trial that we had where the first time I saw over 200 bushel corn with 0 nitrogen. That was amazing. Now, that field also had a little bit of a history of some cattle manure and had some alfalfa on it in the recent history. Mineralization, that comes into play. I had a trial on my own last year for a neighboring farm that we put on 0 to 270 pounds of nitrogen at V5 as UAN. Just used an easy drop, applied that at V5. And the EONR was about 135, 150, whereas neighboring guys were probably in the 180s or so. Being able to apply that in season was really good. But even at 0 nitrogen, we're still picking up 180 bushel corn. It was pretty amazing. Having a soil that was well drained, in this case, it was tile drained, not as common in southern Iowa as a lot of other folks. And then have that field was also chisel plowed in the fall from soybean going to corn. Again, not typical. Gave it a lot of mineralization potential along with the weather that we had. And so that really drove that there. So it was one thing that really kind of stood out in my time was like, wow, you can actually get some lower nitrogen rates if you test for it. You still just put on one straight rate at a high level, you're never going to know this. You're going to mask a lot of that. And I think another follow-up with this too, what I learned is in this trial with the myriad of rates that we had, we also, just like a lot of the Midwest, was hit with southern rust this year. And as I was going through this plot, I was noticing there were parts of the field in the plot, the 0 and the 90-pound nitrogen application rates had less southern rust on them than the higher rates. And this was something that somebody pointed out at our field days. Well, look at this corn over here and look at that over there. There's quite a difference in rust infestation. And so it's caused me to dig a little deeper into that and realize that, you would have free nitrates and free amino acids in corn. If they're not assimilated into the plant, if there's extra amounts in there, they're going to be attractants for disease and insects. It's been very well proven. And so, it made me think like, wow, all this money we're spending on fungicides and we're spending on above ground protection for insects on corn, this could be maybe not eliminated, but quite a bit of it could be reduced if we had that right nitrogen rate.
Sure.
So not to say, I'm not going to say somebody just go out and put 0 nitrogen on and call it all good, but we also just ought to be thinking maybe we ought to take a little more credit for the nitrogen that's in the soil and not just apply a blanket rate every year.
Let's press into that for a second, because this gets into the realm of part of the whys that I like to ask that I think it deserves some illumination. Having spent some time working with Wisconsin's nitrogen optimization program up here, part of the research structure that they say you must do are zero N rate strips. And so it's been an incredibly illuminating exercise to do that zero N rates. These are true zeros, like there are literally 0 pounds of applied nitrogen. Similar observations yourself, perhaps not as robust a yield, but it feels like what we're seeing up here is that we can grow 100 bushel corn all day long on 0 pounds of applied nitrogen in northern Wisconsin. And I'm absolutely fascinated by that effect. You're talking about circumstances down there in really fertile soils where you're growing 180, 200 bushel corn. Now, let's take that a step further. So if we assume you're working with 3 to 4% organic matter soils, and we traditionally assume 20, 25 pounds, let's just call it 25 for easy math, pounds of nitrogen mineralized for each percent of organic matter, you do the math, 4 times 25 gets you 100 pounds of nitrogen, but you're seeing 200 bushel corn. Mm-hmm. Any speculation on where this phantom 100 pounds of nitrogen is coming from? Because the math doesn't math in those circumstances.
It doesn't, no. Again, we know that 25 pounds is a rule of thumb. It's a book value. And I think that number is going to change depending on the year. In our case, with this tile drain field, we had fairly dry soils through the spring, early plant, April 16th. So it got in there in pretty good time. The soil was able to mineralize nitrogen pretty early there. I think if we, in our clay pan type soils, without tile drainage, we will have a lot more denitrification loss. We really don't have a lot of leaching because water moves down and hits the clay pan, just stops and maybe goes sideways. But in this case, because it was tile drained, it lowered that water table down. So we had a lot more breathing room, a lot more of that nitrification and mineralization, but it didn't go anywhere. With nitrification, you can have that nitrate lost one way or the other. Again, it's not going to go either direction if there's not a lot of water, just enough. It's at that Goldilocks level, just right. So I think in our case, we did see a lot more mineralization going on than that 25 pounds. Granted, it was 4.5% organic matter, and I've tested down to 2 foot depth and still find 3.5%, 4% organic matter in our soils. So it's pretty stout there. But I think it somehow picked it all up there and took it all it could. So I think the 25, 30 pounds is a good rule of thumb, good book value, but I think it can vary quite a bit depending on the season. And that's why I really like the idea of putting down some of your nitrogen ahead of time, like from a logistics standpoint, but then coming back and topping off the rest of it in season. I know logistics beats strategy every day of the week, but if you have the ability to do that, side dress it. Once the seasons come along, you've got 45, 60 days under your belt since planting. Side dress what you can based upon if it was a pretty wet spring, then put on a little more. If it's been a nice dry, maybe a little bit less was what you need.
Sure. Makes a whole lot of sense. I'm also starting to question whether or not there are other sources of nitrogen contributing to these systems that maybe we just haven't even considered. There may be some residual nitrogen at depth that those roots are able to tap into that's not necessarily been mineralized, but just left over from previous growing seasons. And it also seems like there may be some implications that plant microbes on the phyllosphere or the plant leaf surface may be able to convert some atmospheric nitrogen. I mean, there are more things that continue to show up on the radar that suggest, hey, there's nitrogen coming from here and they're coming from there, and maybe starts to put together the puzzle how we can bridge that gap between 100 pounds of applied or 0 pounds of applied in a 200 bushel crop.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I've done total digestion tests on soils in my area, and they come back at, 0.2, 0.25% as nitrogen. Well, you work that out 2 million pounds per acre slice. At that 6-inch depth, that's about 5,000 pounds of nitrogen just in the top 6 inches. Now, not all of that is plant available, of course, but we do know that the more nitrogen, the more organic matter you have, the more nitrogen you're probably going to have. The more nitrogen you're going to have, the more mineralization it could mineralize. And if you have the right conditions, it could really deliver. And again, 5,000 pounds in the top 6 inches, there's probably that much or a little bit less in the next 6 inches. So there's plenty of nitrogen sitting out there. It's just a matter of how do we access it when the crop needs it. And one of our problems too is that, I'm sure as you find in Wisconsin, our planting windows moved from early or mid-May here in Southern Iowa to early May to late April to now, as soon as we can, forget about the crop insurance date. We're just going to go plant, even if it's the first week of April. Well, we don't have a lot of mineralization going on just yet. And so a lot of that mineralization is going to hit when the soil gets up to 75, 80 degrees. And if we don't have a lot of, wet soils, it stays in that nice Goldilocks field capacity levels. Yeah, we'll probably start seeing that in June-ish or so. And then that's when the crop really is starting to hit and take off there. In the past, we planted a little bit later. The crop's going to be able to start accessing that sooner. So we need that extra supplemental nitrogen a little bit up ahead of time until the soil can start producing enough and it'll take up there. So, but that doesn't discount all the suggestions you have as well.
Those are great insights. Thanks for sharing. Want to go back to something you said just a couple of minutes ago to tie up this part of our conversation in regards to the lower nitrogen rates in your trials showing lower disease pressure. I think it's really important to emphasize this because I see this popping up more and more frequently too. that excess nitrates in the plants are causing negative consequences. And as you had illustrated there, it seems to be from a disease pressure standpoint, but it sounds like there's many other factors that could be negatively affected when you have these excess nitrates in the plants too. And I guess the implication from that, based on what you're sharing there, is that, if we do a better job of managing nitrogen, we take away the negative consequences of over application. I think that's a fascinating opportunity, especially as we watch the price of urea spike here just over the weekend. Everyone's going to be looking for more ways and reasons why they can dial that.
And the thing is, it just takes a little bit more management, and that's the thing. I understand farmers are dialed in for time. They have issues with that, but when you put all your cards on the table right ahead of time, back in the fall, like a lot of fall anhydrous is put on in this area, or even here right now, my neighbors were putting on anhydrous just a couple of days ago. And so you put all your nitrogen out there at once, and you have really no way to say, well, was that too much or too little? And I'd rather be able to say, hey, can we pull it back? Can we figure out ways to manage this better for not only for your profitability, but also downstream effects? One of the things I'm very interested in doing is making sure that we're being good stewards of land. And when there's no penalties to put in on extra nitrogen, other than the pocketbook, but there's more downstream effects that now Des Moines has to turn on its nitrate removal system, lest we have bad water or blue babies and such. Then we need to. There's extra external cost there, and we're passing it on. So I think there's things that we need to be doing better as in agriculture, and especially here in Iowa. We need to, in regards to nitrogen management, that we can do. And digital and precision ag can contribute to this. It's not rocket science anymore. It is a common practice. It's been, like I said, been around here for 10, 15 years, and it's continued to grow. So the adoption of this should take off, but there also has to be a desire, a demand for it. And until there's I don't want to create a stick approach for farmers. I think there's still room for the carrot, but I think that, the carrot may become less likely in the future, unfortunately, more likely the stick, if we don't start voluntarily adopting these technologies and doing things the right way. And like I said, with $700, it might start moving that in that way too.
Absolutely. You had mentioned previously the split application just seems to be kind of a no-brainer approach to doing nitrogen better. Are there other strategies that you've come across in your research that be like, yeah, these are ways we can increase our nitrogen use efficiency?
Yeah, I did. When I was at Corteva, I did a study on nitrification inhibitors, nitropyrin, which is the active ingredient that Corteva is selling. And wanted collect some data just for modeling purposes and also really test this out. And so I found a few farmers in my area that did fall anhydrous and worked with the co-op, and they put on some with and some without this nitropyrin with N-Serve. So between December through April of that year, I went out with a gas drill and drilled in knife marks and between the knife marks down to 0 to 12 and 12 to 24 inches and obtained the nitrate and ammonium values. So December, January, February, March, April. And that's why I had a gas drill, because the ground was pretty frozen at times. And what I found was it worked. I mean, the nitropyrin does slow down the conversion of ammonium to nitrate. One field had anhydrous ammonium applied just right around Halloween time. And soil temperature was still pretty warm at that point. But when we looked at the ratio of ammonium to nitrate, there was still a lot of ammonium, 4 to 1, 5 to 1 amounts of ammonium compared to nitrate in that field. A field diagonal across from it was nitrogen applied a month later, right around Thanksgiving. Same kind of situation. But farmers, a couple of fields, and these were all within a 5-mile area, not very far away. A couple of other guys put on anhydrous in November without N-Serve, but the temperature, the weather was going to drop, the temperature was going to drop, the weather was going to change, but they still had some conversion there, right as the soil was still in the 50s, the 50, 55 degree temperature. And so we found more nitrate in that soil than ammonium, or about a 1-to-1 ratio there. Now, the question that farmers always ask me about N-Serve and things like that is, well, does it pay? Well, I can tell you it works. Now, I can't guarantee it's going to pay, because that year, going from 2022 to 23 was a dry spring, and probably we didn't have any losses due to denitrification or leaching. But if we had a year where it was, we got 10 inches of rain in the spring, absolutely it would have paid big time. So there's technologies like that. Again, I'm not a big fan of suppressing bacteria. I think we ought to put nitrogen on when it needs to be, and we need to do things that enhances our ability to mineralize nitrogen out of the soil as best as possible. But, in that case, the nitropyrin did its job.
Yeah, that's fascinating to hear. It seems like these stabilizers are sound investment. Regardless, it's just great insurance policy. We spent a lot of time talking about nitrogen, and that's great. I think it's a great topic to talk about. What else in the digital and precision space do you feel like those types of technologies that will have significant impact as agriculture moves forward?
So when I came on here at Iowa State, I said there's going to be 3 things that our students are going to be dealing with in 10 years, if not sooner. It may become standard practice. I said the first one's going to be AI. AI is going to be very much of our process. I think every field is going to have AI running on it one way or another. So if they're an agronomist, a crop consultant, or something like that, there's going to be some AI that's going to be helping them make decisions on that. The next thing is autonomy. So as we have AI being able to enable machines going across the field, machine visioning to observe things, to make decisions, autonomy is going to be our way to enable things. So there's some great technology out there. I saw it at a farm show earlier this year. Robot weeding systems that can just go out, run in the field, and knock weeds out of the fields. I think that's really fascinating, and it made my head go towards thinking like, maybe we could go back to non-GMO soybeans, right? And get maybe a premium out of that. We wouldn't have to worry about all the various tanks mixes we have to do for the post-applied and the second post-emerge, and worry about resistance. Nothing's become resistant to a piece of steel yet. So that was an interesting area. And so the third part is then again stewardship. I think because we have AI and we have the ability to understand things very complex in a very complex process, multivariate processes that going on, just like we talked about earlier. And we have autonomy. We have machines that will be able to do things not necessarily to replace people, but to do the jobs we aren't doing now that we should be doing. That's the way I look at that. The third thing is stewardship. And it's going to allow us to do things we should be doing, but we're not doing because we think they cost too much for us to do. And that might mean that we learn that there are certain parts of fields that just are not productive, that should not be farmed like they are, that maybe are better suited for different purposes. Now, I also realize that may take a change in policy, insurance, for example, or crop payments, or what's our standards. But again, that kind of goes back to that. Maybe we've realized that these are certain practices in the past we've done that although they're expedient, although they were profitable, they were also passing that cost downstream, no pun intended. But today, now we understand that better. And so we can do a better job that's not going to be hurting people downstream or putting those extra costs there, but also help our own profitability and our sustainability. Stewardship, I like that term because it puts the onus back on us to be good stewards of land. We're given that command. And I think through these technologies and tools, we can do that.
Wonderful. Would you be able to cite an example from each of those three buckets that you are actively involved in or have seen firsthand taking place?
Yeah, on the AI side, a former colleague of mine from Corteva, he and I have started a company called Lenovo AI Solutions. Nicole Patel and I have developed a product called Ask My Farm. Ask My Farm is a AI powered farm management. I call it intelligence solution. FMIS's farm management information software in the past has been, hey, let's just bring in all your your harvest data or your farm records, and we'll process it. We'll give you a nice graph, give you some reports, these things, so forth. And that was what we tried to do with Granular Business back in the day, and other companies. And so things that kind of rose, that came down a little bit too. But with the ability with AI, the benefit there is that we have the ability to bring in these different data sources that are formatted differently, that are unstructured perhaps, and be able to bring those in and make something coherent out of this. So for example, with Ask My Farm, we're connecting up with John Deere Ops Center. We're bringing in field batteries, machine data, all the activities that you would do there in John Deere Ops Center, excuse me, and then be able to bring in scattering reports, bring in soil test data, bring in the weather and other environmental information, and be able to synthesize a story. Emphasize this, really the context, understanding of why did things turn out the way they did at the end of the year. Examples, we brought in machine data from one of my clients that I scouted for last summer, brought in the soil test that I took on their farms in the spring. Then we also brought in the scatter reports. And we were able to tell a story, like here are all the different things, activities that went on. Now here are the watchouts next year, potassium, low potassium here, pH there, this ragweed patch in the southeast part of the field. And that's part of the farm memory. So we can take that information and use that for future guidance, for this year's guidance, for example, and we can live that on. So that's where I think AI can be super useful to take that complex, multivariate information, unstructured data, and make something of it.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Real quick, I just want to ask a question because I think you've touched on something that really can be very practical. I was having this conversation just the other day with somebody, and you look at a yield map and you see a spot on that yield map, and you go, why'd that turn red there? What happened? And you got enough data layers in there now that perhaps there's enough in those various data layers where, whether it's things like weed pressure and, it's soil, it's not easy right now to ask the system, why is that red? Do you feel like the AI tool has enough capability where you can ask that, why is that red? And it can synthesize if the data's there and provide that answer?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, even before AI, we were able to do this to an extent with statistics and machine learning to almost an extent. But that would mean, basically breaking that field up into small raster blocks and bits, and then filling in those with all that data as possible. When I was with Premier Crop Systems way back in the late 90s, early 2000s, we started doing the type of work. We called them mega surfaces. And this was just basically surface, stacked on top of each other, these multiple layers of information through those and try and find if there's any statistical relationships that go on there. And that was, again, before machine learning really took off. And we could do some multivariate regression to help find those relationships. But still, there's opportunities we could do there. So yeah, with AI, it's even easier to do that today. But I think also now you can bring in that, again, the unstructured data, or the data doesn't quite fit in those grids, like the weather, for example. And then we could simulate through modeling watershed movement, water running off the hills during saturated conditions. And I'll start to apply some of those conditions to it as well that we didn't have in earlier days.
Fascinating. And I think before I interjected there, you were going to cite another example.
Yeah, well, I was going to move on to talking about autonomy, one of the projects that we've worked there. So this trial I mentioned about the nitrogen trial from last year, it was actually a nitrogen by seeding rate study with 2 different hybrids involved there too, with 3 replications. But the fascinating part of it was all done robotically. I worked with a company here in Ames called Saline 24/7. And Dave Krogh, the CEO from that, brought down one of their units as a 4-row planter, or set up with 4-row planter at the time. And we used that with our TK guidance to plant the field, plant the plots. I created a script to upload into the precision planting controller so that as it's moving along, the planter row units would shut off and make alleyways, and then plant for 17.5 feet, turn back on again, and then turn back off. And so we could do a small plot trial with this, with that machine. And likewise, and it also changed the population rate as we went along. So created this 26, 34, and 42,000 pop. About 2 months later, we came back and side dressed it at V5 with the same machine. And we set up different nitrogen rates for that. And so they could dribble on UAN with different rates based upon the script that we used there. And so I could say that that was the first robotically planted corn in my county, probably in the four county area, or at least there. It was fun because I had high school students come out and watch it as well. So they get to remember this day that weird Bob Gunzenhauser guy was out there with this robot planting corn. But it's kind of cool. I mean, it's what we're going to see in the future. And so that same kind of machine could be utilized to be deployed across as a swarm across a field. It could be utilized, as I mentioned, about the weeding to take care of weeds there. And I think it's going to change a little bit the dynamics of how we farm. And there's initiatives out there. The larger manufacturers are saying that, we can automate, make it autonomize a full-size 400 horsepower tractor to go off and do tillage work. You can get that going, and then you can imagine a farm operation have 3 or 4 of these, and you may have 1 or 2 people operating them. You may actually have one guy operating them and one guy just to drive the other guy around, just to move the tractors to different fields. And that's one real potential future option there. Another may be that you'd have, again, a fleet of these autonomous machines that are loaded up on trailers, and you just move them around to a field, and then they go deploy them, let them go. And they may be, doing the tasks that typically would cost too much, the weeding aspect, or maybe there's soil sampling or observations that can be done there. Things that, again, if you paid somebody to do it, it wouldn't be worth it. But because we were running this machine across it enough, and it's doing it in a very timely fashion, running 24/7, maybe it gets the cost down. So I think the vision of autonomy is still to be defined out there. There's a lot of players, but I think it's really fascinating. One thing I'm a little still concerned about is, how's that going to affect labor? Mm-hmm. How do people involved in labor still find value in what they do? I think there's value in, having value in labor and meaning and such. But just like a lot of things with the change of technology, we've learned how to adapt and move forward.
That's incredible. It seems like real farming, becoming more like a video game with every technology change. That's great. How about on the stewardship side, an example from that one?
I think what I would say that, my previous example there with the nitrogen results there help us to understand that, yes, we can produce really good corn with lower nitrogen rates. And I think those are lessons we've learned there. I think as we learn more about the soil DNA tests or biological tests, understand mineralization potential and model that better, I think there's opportunities there. Yeah, I think one thing I like about the Saline 24/7 approach is that it is a lightweight machine. It's not going to compact the soil very much. And that's really what it's touted for. And so, to tippy toe across the field, and you see the tracks, but it's not very heavy. I think there's some opportunities there, again, to reduce soil compaction, to do things that are, a lighter weight fashion that And again, to go to places and times that maybe we usually don't want to go.
Yeah, fascinating. Well, thank you for that. Any last comments you want to talk about in the digital precision space before I rapid fire some other questions at you?
Well, I think there's a lot of things that digital and precision ag can do to get things executed properly and to be able to manage that information. It all does come back to fundamentals, right? If you don't have the fundamentals of agronomy and machine worked out, digital and precision ag, it's like icing on the cake. So yeah, let's just jump right into talking about some of the fundamentals in agronomy that we would like to talk there.
Yeah, absolutely. The fun part, right? So the first question I want to fire at you is, what low-cost tool or technique under $500 has had the biggest impact on improving your work, and how'd you apply it?
So I'm going to go right back to digital and precision ag again, but it's just literally Google Earth on my phone.
Really? Google Earth?
That is it.
Why?
Well, I'll tell you. So when I was left Corteva and set up my own crop consulting, I was courted by a lot of different software companies and talked to a number of folks, and they had a certain amount of price they'd want for the software. But I decided just to go with QGIS. It's a free GIS software, and I knew how to program in R. And then and with both of those, I could create KMZ files for my soil sample points, throw them out there on Google Drive, upload, pull them off with Google Earth, and use them to navigate me to my sample points. Now, people are going to argue, well, that's not very accurate. Within 10 feet, it's pretty good. So, and I've used that where I've gone back to where I've taken plant samples, tissue samples last summer. And, so I see there's missing corn plants, and sure enough, using that same thing, even with all the multi-path issues going on with the corn out there, it still got me pretty darn close. So that's my low-cost tool right there is throwing KMZ files into Google Earth and using that for my navigation for soil sampling and tissue sampling.
That is awesome. What a great hack of the system. I love that one. If you could design a billboard message to reach every participant in crop production, what would it say in 10 words or less?
Well, I'm going to hammer the nitrogen thing again, but credit nitrogen mineralization. I would ask people to start thinking about not so much what is the nitrogen rate to apply, how much anhydrous or how much nitrogen do we need to apply, how much do we start with? Let's start there. Let's start thinking about that first, then supplement it with nitrogen. I think we could turn this whole thing on its head with a different discussion, but we need to start crediting nitrogen mineralization first.
And so I would traditionally follow that question up with why, but I think we've already talked about the why. So I'm going to ask a different question instead. I listened to a presentation from Professor Mulvaney at Illinois talk about his nitrogen data, where he's suggesting 30 to 40% of the total uptake of nitrogen in a corn crop via radio labeling detection is coming from your fertilizer, leaving anywhere between 70 and 60% coming out of the soil profile.
Mm-hmm.
Why don't agronomists figure out a way to credit for that? Do you have any thoughts on this? Why are we as a group and farmers as a group just so hesitant to look at the soil and say, there's something of value there, put a number?
Yeah. Well, I think a little bit of that, what Mulvaney found there in Illinois, what was found also in Minnesota, I believe some work was being done at South Dakota, North Dakota State as well. I visited with somebody about that. When you inject a large amount of nitrogen, relatively, let's say 180 pounds of nitrogen as anhydrous or as UAN or urea into the soil that changes that C to N ratio, and it causes the bacteria just to say, hey, something's wrong here, guys. Let's figure this out. So I think there's some immobilization that takes place. I believe there's some immobilization that takes place. And I've asked a few about this, and they said, yeah, there is. But then at the same time, then some of that nitrogen, organic nitrogen, does get mineralized as credit again. Where my hypothesis is, I think, and I'd love to test this out, make sure that labeled nitrogen is not completely lost. Like I said, 30 or 40% is taken by a plant, but some of it's still back in the soil. I've always asked them, what happens if you grow the crop next year?
Exactly. Yep.
What will that label, will you get some of that nitrogen back there? And I think the answer is yes. It's not all completely lost unless you have completely, leached out or something like that. So I think, when you inject so much nitrogen in the soil at a given time, it causes an imbalance. The soil has to react, it immobilizes some of it, releases some of it back later as well, but of its own sourced nitrogen, organic to inorganic forms. And so then that makes us think, okay, well, is it really smart then? I mean, logistically, yes, we'd like to just dump it all out there once and call it good. The corn grows, that's awesome. But is that what the plant is designed or is expecting? No, the soil's not expecting that. The plant's not expecting that. They're expecting it to be metered out in a slow amount. And we just want the corn to get more of it than the soil can produce. But I think that's a lot of our problems there. So that's my take on that, is that we're not really losing all that nitrogen. It's just that it's getting captured and then being released later.
Sure. And I think that kind of comes back to this idea that we know it's there. We kind of have an inkling it's there. We're not comfortable enough taking a credit for it yet. To that end, do you feel like there's any soil test or any other way to measure nitrogen, either at the beginning of the season or maybe prior to side dress? Anything that gives us a value?
So traditionally we've used the inorganic test, the nitrate and ammonium soil test, and that tells us what's presently there. There's been the pre-side dress nitrate tests. States use, there's an Illinois dress nitrate. I think it's amino acid approach there. I've used POC, permanganate oxidizable carbon test. That is not a nitrogen test per se, but it's it's like a carbon quality type of test. There's a lot of talk about WEOC, water extractable organic carbon, as a proxy as well. These all kind of correlate with and also with just loss and ignition organic matter. These all kind of are in the same orbit to give you an idea of what potential mineralization is. And there is mineralization tests that take 48 hours or 72 hours to run, but there's not always a strong correlation back to the field at times, and they also cost a little bit more. I like the POC test. I ran those a number of years ago because I ran across a bunch of different soils all the way from Ohio back to Iowa here. I found take a 3.5% organic matter, I could see about a 2x range between POC values for the same organic matter. Like one would be 300, one would be 600 parts per million, both 3.5% organic matter. So there's different qualities of that. And I thought, well, that's very fascinating. And why is that the case? And didn't take that as far as I could have, I suppose, but I think there's more we can discover there.
Absolutely. Well, great message on your billboard, man after my own heart. Figuring out a way to credit soil nitrogen is definitely the pinnacle of what we should all be striving for. 100% in agreement there. Next question I'm going to throw at you here is, what's one piece of conventional wisdom in the crop production or soil health arena that you believe is outdated, harmful, and what data or experience have convinced you to reject that idea?
So one thing I learned from my time with Encirca and Granular, and one thing I actually really want to change, was the use of a yield goal or a yield target. I think that can be taken too far, too deep. Do I want to know generally, is this ground, could it produce 240 bushels an acre, or could it produce 120 or 150? Yeah, I generally want to know that. But to be able to say, well, this spot here is 237, this here is 241, this spot over here is 200, whatever. No, we can't predict that. When we went back and looked at the yield data compared to those yield targets, we got like a 0.12 R squared. It was a terrible correlation. So I would say, other than very broad understanding for a general region, not I'm a field, but a region, what's a yield potential for an area, that might be it. But once you take it down the field, and especially subfield, I think that's you're really asking a lot of it. And I think the next thing that's worse is then when you take that by a multiplier, like 1.2 for pounds of nitrogen per acre.
Yes, indeed.
So yeah, rules of thumb built on rules of thumb, built on, model built on a model built on a model. You lose some clarity there after years or after time there. And so let's just get right. Let's just, call it what it is. It could be very inaccurate. So let's maybe not use those type of things. Now, I get it. People say, well, I want to understand what's the potential of this field, and one number, or of this zone, one number to represent that is easy. It's nice, and especially if they're relative to others. I get that. And we don't want to talk about, well, it depends. It depends on the water holding capacity. It depends on the rainfall we get for that. It depends on the mineralization potential. I get it. But to use fast and loosely yield targets by zones and applying rates to them, I came to the realization that was not the right approach. And I would discourage people from using that at a subfield level for sure. And generally at a field level, I'd be concerned with too.
Sure. I mean, and then what's the alternative? What's your way to approach that you think has a smidge more efficacy?
Great question. Yeah. And so then it brings in the whole question of, management zones and productivity zones and like that as well. And how do you rank those? And I've come to the realization with management zones, there's no one size fits all for every area. I think it would work in the prairie provinces of Saskatchewan will be different than the sands of Wisconsin versus the rolling hills of southern Iowa. And there's different tools and technologies, again, back to the digital precision ag, different ways to come about that. But I think what a farmer or a consultant for an area, represent an area, can do is develop their own tools, put together their own genotypic, and I call them genotypic and phenotypic tools of soil data, fertility, or soil topography, remote sensing, whatever it is, all those inputs, and build their own that represents the variability of the soil best as possible. What are the inputs that they want to include in that? And then, then build their models tuned to that. So whether the model is just a if this then that, or X plus X times this value, or some machine learning or AI, all those models can be different. But I think it may just depend on your local region and how you interpret it, how you want to provide value to the farmer.
Yeah, that makes sense. The next one I have for you here is, what question about crop production or soil health do you wish more experts and practitioners would ask themselves, and how would answer it change our industry?
Yeah, I think if we, as I mentioned before, if we start thinking about what's downstream, not only spatially, that is, running down physically downstream, but also temporally over time. What do we do? What are the effects that we'd have if we ask ourselves those questions more often than just say, well, we've got to, make the bank payment this fall? Then I think we'd change things around. And I get it. I was there. As a farmer, I was thinking, I don't have time to think to wonder and ponder these big questions. I've got to get this crop in the ground, get it growing, get it harvested, sell it, pay the bill, pay my loan, start over next year. I get that. But it's important for sometimes some folks to step back and say, okay, what is the downstream effects of all we're doing here? As I've gone through and done soil sampling and accidentally taken soil samples at where the old barn was at, where the old feedlot was at, and they come back really high, and I think, probably when they were raising hogs in the 1920s and 30s and 40s, they probably weren't even thinking about they'd have really high fertility levels out there anymore, and the effects of that. And so, we just need to think, what are we doing today? Are we going to leave our land in a better condition for future generations? Are we going to help those downstream from us as well? Are we, even bigger questions like, why are we doing what we're doing today? Yes, we can grow lots of corn, lots of soybeans, but is that something we should be doing? And what's our alternative? And maybe those are things that feel like you're above your pay grade, but sometimes it's good to think about that.
Along those lines, do you think it's a zero-sum game? I mean, can we have our cake and eat it as well by maximizing crop in this year through the decisions we're making, but also having positive impact further down the road? And what does that potentially look like?
Yeah, that's a great question, because if we, our understanding is that we must produce fence row to fence row and optimize production as much as possible. To whose benefit is that? Is it to society in general? Well, yeah, it means that we have low cost food and fuel, of course, too, with ethanol. Is that helping the rural economy? Is it helping the small towns? Maybe not. The decline of populations kind of, express that. You see that. And that's one thing I struggle with. I wrestle with too, is that while I work in the space and technology and I like it, I also know that technology has been used to eventually, there's fewer people needing to do things, especially in agriculture. And is that a good thing or a bad thing? Well, some people I see on social media pine for the days like, oh man, if I just go back to having a 40/20 and a 6-row planter, I'd be really happy. And well, why do you stop there? Why not go back to a 7/20 and a 3-bottom plow? Well, why do you stop there? Why don't you go back to, the horses? Well, there's a reason why. We can pine for the good old days, but were they really good old days? And so I wonder about that with technology. And so some days, people say, oh, I wish I was back in, 2005. Like, you know what? When we were in 2005, we were wishing it was back earlier. So, you go down memory lane there, but the point is that we need to understand what technology is doing. We need to understand the effects it would have. Can we get to a point where technology, especially advanced technology like digital precision, can it get us to this utopia? No, I don't believe in utopianism. I believe it can help things out, alleviate things. It may give us new opportunities to study. I think it can, if we're guiding it properly, we think about it properly, it can help us again with that stewardship. The stewardship opportunity could also get ignored too in the process. But I also say that with great tools and great power comes great responsibility. So as you're able to do more things, you're able to plow more acres per day, or you're able to plant more, you're able to spray more. You can do a lot more damage in one pass than there. That means we got to be more responsible for what we're doing too.
Great answer. I think that's a bit of hope and optimism. I'm glad that you responded in the way you did. That's very helpful. One more for you. And I'm just curious if there are 2 people in your network whose work and insights you think deserve to have more visibility.
Yeah, I'm going to give a shout out to Jason Mock and Zach Smith. So these 2 guys have been doing a lot of work with strip intercropping, with integrating livestock back into things. Zach has really started things with the stock cropper concept and the cluster cluck machines. And it really challenges the concepts around, how can we integrate livestock and agronomy back together? And he's dealt with a lot of the same challenges we just discussed. Like, if he's worked out the numbers. If we were able to bring livestock back to the land and run them in mobile cages or pens, as the stock cropper system is, through the field, we could increase the gross profit off of per acre of a land very much so, and reduce our amount of manure that we did, or nutrients we'd have to apply. And there's it's proven out with that studies that we can get very good yields off that former land or the ground that was in the stock cropped area before. There's things that I think both those, and what Jason's been doing with integrating soybeans and wheat together to intercrop those, and the solar corridor concepts. And that's one thing we also tested out on my trials this last year too. Both those guys have done that. I think thinking about farming weird. I think those guys are really good about farming weird, thinking about how that can be done. But they're not just farming weird for just be weird sake. They're just saying, how can we scale this, or how this could be adopted? And as I've talked with them before, again, I'm going back to digital precision ag, but that's one way we can make this scale. And that's one thing I explained is that, the technology already exists for us to do this. You don't have to have a lot of specialized equipment. We can make this all happen to do strips for solar corridors. We can have machines moving livestock through the strips there and harvesting things. We could use crop models to figure out what blend of species of forages we need to have and when do we need to seed them so that we get that optimum protein as we go along. And so these guys are really pushing the curve on this. I think sometimes they probably feel like they're shot in the wind and not getting a lot of traction, but they're getting heard. People are hearing this. And so I just continue to encourage them, what they're doing, and attract others to what they're saying. And for others to also think about, well, what does it mean to farm weird and farm a little differently so that I don't have to maybe fit into a certain paradigm that's been presented, but maybe I can try something different and break out and develop something interesting that really balances, again, the technology, the agronomy, and the sustainability and stewardship all together at one time.
Sure. I think that those are two great choices for people who deserve some more visibility. And perhaps then, what they're doing is part of the answer of the cake and eat it question, in that, yes, you can be wildly profitable and successful this year, but also be doing good things for the future of your land and minimizing the negative impact. So great choices in that regard. Well, we've had a great conversation here and just about ready to wrap this up. For those who may be interested in following more of your work, where is the best place that they can find you?
Probably find me right on X, or formerly Twitter, Bob Gunzy, BOBGUNZY. I post on there often about some of the work I've been doing there in the fields. I'm a little quiet right now, so I'm starting to kind of get rolled up here at Iowa State, but go back in my archives, you'll see a lot of the work I posted about the strip cropping, solar corridor concept, these small plots. Also, a lot of work I did over correlating soil tests and tissue tests last fall. Sometimes I'll post something about the chickens or the goats that we have on our farm as well. A lot of focus on that, but that's one way you can probably follow me the best there. I'm also on LinkedIn, and that's a little more professional. But if you want some interesting stuff out there, some interesting takes on agriculture, you'll probably find me on X.
That sounds great. Bob is indeed a great follow. Encourage anyone who's interested in this conversation, give him a follow. There are lots of great insights. And so with that said, any parting words for us that you'd like to share?
Thank you, Joe, for the opportunity to come on here. And I want to make sure that listeners understand my approach is I want to see the best for agriculture, for American agriculture primarily. And of course, I'm very focused on Iowa, but, American agriculture, we need to keep on moving. And I think there needs to be a balance to be threaded between technology and stewardship and taking care of our rural communities as well. Sometimes people think that, well, technology, that's anti-community, that's anti. It's like, no, I think there's opportunities, but we need to understand it better, how it's going to affect things. And I'm not talking about we all go Amish, although the Amish sometimes have some good ideas. We don't all have to do that, but we do need to be practical with the use of technologies and understanding them, the downstream effects of those. We just need to be good neighbors as well with who we are. And I think understanding as much as what's been given to us. I believe God's given us this wonderful earth, and in it, all that's in it, and because He created it, it's infinitely ununderstandable, but we can try to understand as best as we can. And so I think it's a quest for us to understand what God's created for us as best as possible and be the best stewards we can with what He's given us.
Insightful parting words. Thanks for being with us here today, Bob, on the Wormhole Agronomy podcast. Hope you enjoyed it, everybody. New episode coming out very shortly. Have a great day.